Welcome to session 36 of Introduction to the Hebrew Bible as we enter part 7 of 2 Samuel, actually, that should say, as we look a little more at King David and his dynasty. Welcome, Christine, as a newbie to the class. It's good to have you join us. I hope that you'll find it a lot of fun. If you don't come back, we're all going to have our feelings really hurt, though. So just so you know.
We're not.
Oh, no, it was so interesting. The last one, I did it after the fact, and it was so fascinating because I've been starting on the Old Testament, and I thought, oh, this is perfect. So
excellent.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So as we go ahead and start, we'll pray our song of Zechariah for the evening. The Lord be with you.
And also
with you.
Let us pray. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel. He has come to his people and set them free. He has raised up for us a mighty Savior, born of the house of his servant David. Through his holy prophets, he promised of old that he would save us from our enemies, from the hands of all who hate us. He promised to show mercy to our fathers and to remember his holy covenant. This was the oath he swore to our father Abraham, to set us free from the hands of our enemies, free to worship him without fear, holy and righteous in his sight, all the days of our life. Amen. So as a reminder, the text we are using for this class, particularly Brueggemann's 1st and 2nd Samuel book from the Interpretation Commentary, which has been a very strong help to me as we've worked through these books. And let's do a little review, see what you remember from last week. Why is it we think probably David moved the ark to Jerusalem? What was his reasoning for that? Why would he want to do that?
Other people were getting blessings from it.
Yeah, right. Because the people that did have it seemed to get a blessing, so that seems good. What other reasons did we talk about?
it was political. He wanted to show that he was the true king of God.
Right. Yeah, it's also kind of a religious political act by using that political symbol to unify. Absolutely. Because remember, before the United Kingdom, the 12 tribes were really a confederated group that wasn't really unified at all by anything other than the worship of God. So he's hoping to use that to bring legitimacy to his own reign. Why does David dance? Does he just get the heebie-jeebies? But why does David dance, and who does not like this dancing?
Reminds me of the movie Footloose.
Michael.
Now, Michael doesn't dance. It's a little footloosey, right? Everybody cut.
Yeah.
Was it Bathsheba?
No, Michael was the right answer. Yeah, it was Michael that liked the dancing.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You're good. Oh, hi, Tony. I just see you there. Good to see you.
Yeah. I was just thinking of, did anybody see Richard Gere's version of King David?
No.
He does that dance, and it was at the time it was widely panned as his diaper dance. He wore what basically looked like a diaper as the ark was brought in.
Yeah, I much prefer the picture they've got here of him just in his kind of tunic. I don't really want to see David in his undies. So David dances in celebration at the idea of Jerusalem being the new royal shrine. But Michael looks on in contempt, kind of as the representative of the old house of Saul. And we talk about, there's a lot of reasons possible for that. One of them being the way that her father, King Saul, would enter into these prophetic ecstatic utterances with the other prophets, and how maybe she's starting to see that happen again and doesn't want that. We don't really know, but she doesn't like it no matter what. All right, next question. What prophet did we meet for the first time with no introduction as to where he came from when David proposed to build a temple?
Was that Nathan?
Yes, Nathan. Excellent. How did that prophet respond when David tells Nathan, hey, I'm going to build a temple? What did Nathan say?
What a good idea. Go right ahead.
Go for it, right? And then, of course, after that, God says, whoa, hold up. This is not okay, right? So God does make Nathan kind of take back. It's kind of like playing parents against each other. It's like you ask your mom and they say no, so you go ask your dad, or vice versa, right? It happens to me all the time right now. What kind of a house does God talk about with David when he responds with this idea of the temple? What does God say he's going to do instead?
He's going to make the house of David, David's descendants, kings for forever. Even if they goof up and he has to punish them, he's not going to take his blessing from David's family.
Yeah, they play on that. The word bayit has the same meaning in English, where house can mean like a physical house or a dynasty. Bayit in Hebrew carries that same double meaning. So God takes advantage of that and says that he will build David a house. He's the house maker in this relationship. All right, next in the story of the sin of David, the great one at least, what warning from Saul's life is manifest in the story of David and Bathsheba? There's something that Saul kind of sucked at that David is here starting to not do well as too.
Oh, go out and fight.
Yes, right. Yeah, that's good. I had a different answer, but I like your answer too. If this were the quiz on the day, I would give that full credit, Barbara. But there's something else that when they said they wanted a king, Samuel said, "Hey, this is what kings do. You don't want a king." And then we see that happening with David and Bathsheba.
Kings take.
Yes.
Take.
Kings are takers. And Nathan reiterates that point in the parable he uses to condemn David, right? In the story of the rich man who takes the young man's sheep. Kings are takers. So maybe what I meant to type is what warning from Samuel is manifest. That's probably a typo there. But I love, Barbara, that I did it wrong and you still got it right. That's pretty impressive. You get 2 extra points for the day.
Oh, wow.
How is Bathsheba identified in this story? And even later when she appears in the genealogy of Christ in Matthew, how is Bathsheba identified or described?
As the wife of Uriah.
Yes, she's always the wife of Uriah the Hittite. This is something David cannot change as much as he think he can. That relationship remains. And I mean, you can, of course, from a feminist perspective, take that as, could she be something other than another man's property? But if you can suspend disbelief for a minute, and know that what I think the text is trying to do is to maintain her original autonomy before David, and to let her keep that identity no matter what David did. But that's just because I tend to be a little more gentle with the Bible than your average liberal.
Saul took Michal, David's wife, and gave her to somebody else. He was mad at David, so he just handed her off to someone else. Why? Yeah.
Carolyn, I agree. This is the Old Testament, and women, unfortunately, at this time were property.
Yeah.
It's the way of the world.
No,
Still is in many places.
we need to change all that.
We see a lot of
that.
women speaking up for themselves and stepping outside that role.
Right.
But,
And if you remember, when we did the book of Judges, I talked about the story of Jael being an example of kind of a subversion of this. This wife of this tribe that was kind of allied with the enemy, Sisera's army, how she winds up perhaps getting revenge for having been a taken wife so long ago, when she kills Sisera with the tent pug through his head. So I mean, both points are right. That at one point, it's important not to be anachronistic when we're looking at ancient texts, to remember that parts of these are reflections of culture, but also it's important to look at the ways that even though it's reflective of culture, there are ways that those narratives get subverted sometimes that are very strange in the ancient world to want to subvert it so strongly. And in fact, what David did would not have been seen as outside of the authority of a king in the ancient world. So the very fact that this is pointed out with condemnation is evidence that the expectations of Yahweh are different than the expectations of other gods, particularly when it relates to the king. Right? Good points, everyone. Nice job. I think I've got a little more review. How does David respond when he's told that Uriah died in battle? How does he respond to this news? weeping, gnashing of teeth, something else?
No, it's like, good, get me his wife.
Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah, not totally sad. He literally says to tell Joab, don't let this thing be evil in your eyes. And our translation translated as don't let it trouble you. But he's literally saying, don't let this be something evil in your eyes. So he's really, saying that he's the one making ethical determinations here. And yet, what are we told of God's view of what happened?
Completely much different.
Yeah, the narrative says the opposite, that this thing was evil in the eyes of Yahweh. So clearly it's the perspective of God that is the perspective that truly matters. Almost done with review. What parable then does Nathan tell to indict David? Does anybody remember the story?
Anthony, do you remember? Considering you're right there.
It's the little lamb.
The little lamb, right? A poor man had one little ewe lamb. He'd sleep with him and eat at his table. I'd kiss it right on its little lammy mouth. This rich man doesn't want to use one of his own flocks for a visitor, so he takes that lamb and slaughters it. And David is angry at this. What does David say should happen to the man in this parable? Kill him, right? The man must die. This rich man who's done this must die.
Oh yeah.
And then Nathan, one of my favorite lines in all of Hebrew scripture, Nathan looks at David and points at him and says, "You are the man." How does David respond when told that he is the evil man in this text?
I can't remember.
Does he have some good excuses to make, or how does he respond to that?
He's real sorry. He's always real sorry. Conveniently sorry after the fact. I'm not a fan of David. I'm sorry.
Carolyn's not going to let David off the hook, right?
I'm not either.
It's one of those. It's a familiar story. Okay, taking Bathsheba in the first place was a sin, but it's the cover up that's really evil.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But all are welcome forgiveness.
Yeah.
So let's move forward, Carolyn, because it does get
Well, and I do think the point remains that as we're kind of doing a literary reading of the text, is from a literary standpoint, the author is trying to draw a contrast between David and whom?
Saul.
Because when Saul says he sinned, Saul has 101 excuses as to why what he did was okay. Saul is not one for owning up, and so I do think that whether or not you think the contrast is worth it, I think the author, from a literary standpoint, is trying to draw a contrast between Saul and David. That it's not so much a question of whether or not you sin. The question is whether or not you are penitent after that sin, whether or not you authentically seek to amend your life. And at least in the narrative itself, it seems that that's the depiction of David that we're getting, right?
The last time, Jared, didn't you talk about we have, responsibilities, and with responsibilities there are consequences to our behavior. I mean, he can apologize all he wants, but there are consequences to his behavior. All this schadenfreude about, losing Uriah. I mean, give me a break.
Oh yeah. When he first gets the message, there's been a big battle and a lot of men were killed, and he's curious, why were they so close to the wall? What was he thinking? And one of them was Uriah. Oh, well, then that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and that was my next question. So nicely done, Christine. There's a difference between forgiveness and consequences, as we hear, and that everyone indeed may receive forgiveness, but that does not mean that you do not have to suffer the consequences for your actions. So David will have to suffer consequences for his sin. Does anyone remember what the consequences will be because of his sin?
Oh, he doesn't get any more sons? Was that it?
No.
That Bathsheba's child dies. That first child dies.
Yes.
No, the first
child.
But later on,
Yeah,
it plays out with really complicated family consequences.
Yeah, David
Yeah.
David tried to solve this with the sword, and so the sword will never depart his house.
Yeah,
Um,
and David took another man's wife, and someone will take his, well, they're just concubines, but even so,
Yeah, there's a yeah, Lex Talionis is still a part of the ethical construct here. Well, let's go ahead. Good review, everyone, and let's begin in what we're doing for today. The stories we're going to deal with today are, I would say, you know, the story of David and Bathsheba is a challenging story. The stories we're doing today are even more challenging in many ways. And so, and most people know the story of David and Bathsheba, but these other stories aren't quite as well known. I'm gonna real quick ask my wife. I think accidentally turned the music on in this office, and so now I'm listening to it, and I don't want it to screw up the recording. Can you turn the music off?
I can't hear the music, so you should be
Yeah, we
good.
can't.
Well, that's good. I mean, I can hear just ever so slightly, and it's really delightful. But I just want to be sure I don't screw my recording up here for you all.
Mhm.
There you
No,
go.
you're good.
We can't
All
hear
right,
it.
so if you've got a Bible, go ahead and turn to 2 Samuel chapter 13.
Yeah.
13, we're going to be beginning with verse 1.
Good.
Right, and just to kind of give you an idea of where we are coming into this text, after everything, you know, after what we did last week, Bathsheba's child dies, Solomon is born, and Joab then goes and fights against the Ammonites, and Joab, who always is kind of David's band, has success. And they utterly destroyed the cities of the Ammonites, and David and his people returned to Jerusalem, which would indicate, as you know, as it says in the text, is that what happens after this is David does what he should have done the first time as a king. David goes with Joab out against the Ammonites, and that's what brings success. So it kind of bookends the story nicely. Instead of staying back in the city of Jerusalem, David does go out into battle, and the people do have success against the Ammonites. And then after that battle, David, it says at the end of chapter 12, David and all the people returned to Jerusalem. And then the next chapter, some time passed. What a wonderful transition line. We don't know how much time, some time passed, and then we'll go and pick it up right there. David's son Absalom had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar, and David's son Amnon fell in love with her. Amnon was so tormented that he made himself ill because of his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible to Amnon to do anything to her. But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of David's brother Shemaiah, and Jonadab was a very crafty man. He said to him, "Oh, son of the king, why are you so haggard morning after morning? Will you not tell me?" Amnon said to him, "Oh, I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." Jonadab said to him, "Lie down on your bed and pretend to be ill, and when your father comes to see you, say to him, 'Let my sister Tamar come and give me something to eat and prepare food in my sight, so that I may eat it from her hand.'" So Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. And when the king came to see him, Amnon said to the king, "Please let my sister Tamar come and make a couple of cakes in my sight, so that I may eat from her hand."
Oh, good Lord.
So the scene is being set here for the drama that's to follow. We have Tamar, the beautiful woman Tamar, introduces Absalom's sister. Amnon is the firstborn son, so he's heir to the throne of David, and Amnon loves his half-sister, but he can't find a way to get what he wants, and it's his crafty friend Jonadab which kind of fashions this scheme for Amnon to kind of help him get what he's wanting with his half-sister. And interestingly enough, and I think in a lot of ways is kind of a following through on the previous narrative, David is made the unwitting go-between here. Possible irony, right? As David, like Uriah, carries the message that will bring trouble, even though David apparently doesn't really know what's going on here. So David is implicated in this story, even though he doesn't know the intentions of those who are using him, which is just, I think, from a rhetorical and literary standpoint, an interesting reality. The story continues as the sin is committed, continuing in verse 7.
Yes.
Then David sent home to Tamar and saying, go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him. So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house where he was lying down. She took dough, kneaded it, and made cakes in the sight and baked the cakes. Then she took the pan and set them out before him, but he refused to eat. Amnon said, send out everyone from me. So everyone was sent out from him. And Amnon said to Tamar, bring the food into the chamber so that I may eat it from your hand. So Tamar took the cakes she'd made and brought them into the chamber to Amnon, her brother. But when she brought them near him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, come, lie with me, my sister. She answered him, no, my brother, do not force me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do anything so vile. As for me, where could I carry my shame? And as for you, you would be as one of the scoundrels in Israel. Now, therefore, I beg you, speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you. But Amnon would not listen to her, and being stronger than she was, he forced her and lay with her.
100% rape.
Yeah, so this is a very grisly story that's told here, where the plot of Jonadab works, and of getting Tamar close to Amnon when he's all alone. When Tamar comes close, he invokes it's a dangerous word in Hebrew, lie with me, shachab, which is one of the euphemisms used for sexual intercourse. Tamar's response, though, is just it's shrewd. She rejects Amnon, but doesn't just say no. She gives several reasons why any of this would not be allowed. And in fact, all of these may indict David as well, since she says, David would give me to you if you asked him, which is, the fact that she thinks that her own father would do that, may be an indictment of David's own ethics at this point. But her response is she's got a lot of reasons why this is a bad idea. Amnon won't listen. He forces himself on her, and that word there is a Hebrew word that carries the connotation of the strong humiliating the weak. So that when she talks about the shame of this will be just great for her to bear, that's what's happening to her in the Hebrew as well. That's being reiterated again when it says that Amnon takes her. The rape is quick. It happens very quick in one verse, but it's going to take 7 years of the rest of this narrative to live through the consequences of this one quick action that Amnon takes. So, questions, thoughts? Were you familiar before tonight with the story of Amnon and Tamar, or is this a story you hadn't listened to before? Most of you, I'm seeing some not. This is something you'd heard of before, so it's not new.
Actually, I have not.
Okay, yeah.
It's new to me.
And
Well, I think
wow, very, very poignant, and especially a lot of parts of my life with my ex.
I think I heard this story first from you, Jared. It's really corrupted me. It's messed me up, man. It's kind of like, Bethany and I, every now and then, we really enjoy watching Law and Order SVU, but every now and then some of those episodes are just too much. It's just so bad that we kind of can't bring ourselves to watch it. And this is, I think, one of the most unsettling texts in the entirety of Scripture to read. Well, let's find out what the aftermath is, continuing in verse 15 of chapter 13. And then Amnon was seized with a very great loathing for Tamar. Indeed, his loathing was even greater than the lust he'd felt for her. And Amnon said to her, get out. She said to him, no, my brother, for this is wrong. In sending me away is greater than the other you did to me. But he would not listen to her. He called the young man who served him and said, put this woman out of my presence, and bolt the door after her. Now she was wearing a long robe with sleeves, so this is how the virgin daughters of the king were clothed in earlier times. So his servant put her out and bolted the door after her. But Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the long robe she was wearing. And she put her hand on her head and went away, crying aloud as she went. Her brother Absalom said to her, has Amnon, your brother, been with you? Be quiet now, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this to heart. So Tamar remained a desolate woman in her brother Absalom's house. When King David heard of all these things, he became very angry, but he would not punish his son Amnon because he loved him, for he was his firstborn. But Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had raped his sister Tamar. So we're seeing here kind of the beginning of the fracturing of David's family. As is often the case with profound sin, is the shame and loathing you feel afterwards is clear in Amnon's case. Once his lustful needs are met, he abhors her, perhaps a reflection of shame turned outward, which is a possibility here. Once more, though, Tamar is articulate. She's the articulate one with the sense of justice, even given what she's just gone through, being clear that what he's doing would be even worse. But once more, Amnon refuses to listen to Tamar. And Tamar leaves, but by choosing to tear her robes, she makes clear what has happened to her. She will not be complicit in a cover-up. She will not pretend that this horrible thing did not happen. So I think Tamar is, not only does Tamar have a pretty strong voice in this text, but Tamar as well is ensuring that people will know what Amnon did, that this won't be kept quiet. So Tamar, I think, is a very strong character in this story. Absalom counsels his sister to hold her peace, is a little more literal translation of that. If as the story plays out, we know he's doing that because Absalom is going to carry that wrong, and he's going to try to make it right himself. So when he's telling her, don't let it trouble you, it's not that he thinks that what happened was okay, but that it's that, you know, that this, as the saying goes, revenge is a dish best served cold. He knows that a time will come when Absalom will need to have consequence for his sin, but that time is going to have to wait, that it's not here. And odds are that what part of what Absalom is hoping is that David will make this right. That David is the king, is the righteous bringer of justice, will affect justice here. And the fact that David is so angry but refuses to punish Amnon demonstrates that he has not caught the lesson from the previous story. Forgiveness and consequences are not the same. When it comes to his own son, he's going to make them the same thing. He's going to refuse to hold his son to the consequences for his sin. When he could have said, I love you, Amnon, I care for you, as a family we'll work to forgive you, but there are going to be consequences to this. So there's a real failing here morally in David, in his kind of lack of action here. Thoughts?
So these are forerunners of the Duggars.
Right? Yeah.
Wow.
Dysfunctional family.
That was pretty robust, but okay.
Other thoughts, questions, comments?
No.
So we'll push on and we'll find Absalom and his vengeance as the story continues. Oops, I went too far for some reason. There we go. Beginning in verse 23. After 2 full years, Absalom had sheep shears at Baal-hazar, which is near Ephraim. And Absalom invited all the king's sons. Absalom came to the king and said, your servant has sheep shears. And the king, will the king and his servants please go with your servant? The king said to Absalom, no, my son, let us not all go, or it'll be burdensome to you. Absalom pressed David, but he would not go, but gave him his blessing. Then Absalom said, if not, please let my brother Amnon go with us. The king said to him, why should he go with you? But Absalom pressed him until he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. And Absalom made a feast like a king's feast. And Absalom commanded his servants, watch when Amnon's heart is merry with wine. And when I say to you, strike Amnon, then kill him. Do not be afraid, for have I not myself commanded you? Be courageous and valiant. So the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. And all the king's sons rose, and each mounted his mule and fled. While they were on the way, the report came to David that Absalom had killed all the king's sons. Not one of them was left. The king rose, tore his garments, and lay on the ground, and all his servants were standing by, tore their garments. But Jonadab, the son of David's brother Shimei, said, well, let not the Lord suppose they killed all the young men, the king's sons. Amnon alone is dead. This has been determined by Absalom from the day Amnon raped his sister. Now, therefore, do not let my lord the king take it to heart, as if all the king's sons were dead, for Amnon alone is dead. So 2 years have passed, as Absalom has waited for the right moment to bring justice to Absalom for his sister Tamar. And he instructs his servants, much as David did in chapter 11 when he instructed his servants to act decisively. Absalom instructs his servants to act decisively and quickly. And in the aftermath, all of the princes, all the sons of David who might be endangered, all flee on their mules. Apparently, that was the royal beast of burden in that day. And also, and you're getting some foreshadowing here by Absalom making a feast like a king's feast. You're seeing that maybe Absalom is not just only interested in justice for Tamar here, but Absalom might also have an eye on the throne, because of course, if he kills Amnon, Absalom is next in line. So Absalom's motives may not be entirely pure or justice oriented here. David is told all of his sons are dead, because no one likes gossip more than a royal household, right? But it's Jonadab, interestingly enough, Jonadab, who previously helped Amnon, who came up with this whole scheme that led to the rape of Tamar. Jonadab clarifies what has happened, and that this was in fact something Absalom had been planning since the day of Tamar's rape.
Grima worm tongue.
Right? Absalom then flees, and David mourns for Absalom, and his heart will go out for him, as we'll see later in the story. Questions, thoughts? So as I said, after 3 years of exile, Absalom's gone. David's heart goes out for Absalom. He wants him back. And so we're going to skip ahead a chapter to chapter 15 now. And we're going to see what happens when Absalom does come back. Beginning in verse 1. After this, Absalom got himself a chariot and horses, and 50 men were ahead of him. He used to rise early and stand beside the road into the gate. When anyone brought a suit before the king for judgment, Absalom would call out and say, "From what city are you?" When the servant said, "Your servant is such a tribe in Israel," Absalom would say, "See, your claims are good and right, but there's no one deputed by the king to hear you." Absalom said, "Moreover, if only I were judge in the land, then all who had a suit or case might come before me, and I would give them justice." And whenever people came near to do obeisance to him, he'd put out his hand, take hold of them, and kiss them. Thus Absalom did to every Israelite who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the people of Israel. We now discover that Absalom is returned to the king's presence after his exile, but he's never really forgiven David for his inaction in the sin against Tamar, and so he begins to lay seeds of rebellion, seeds to take the throne from his father David. He acquires his own chariot, horses, his own men to run ahead of him, making his own military procession. Remember the way that David first won honor when he usurped the throne from Saul was by becoming a military hero. So Absalom is trying to cast himself once more in that light. He also takes over the system of justice in the country, which seems to have been abandoned by his father. It should be, if people need justice, they go before the king and the king brings them justice. But David is apparently not doing what he should have been doing in that area. So Absalom's, well, I'll take it over. And if I was in charge, this wouldn't happen. There would be justice and people to hear your cases. Jumping ahead a little bit to verse 13. And a messenger came to David saying, "The hearts of the Israelites have gone after Absalom." And David said to all his officials who were with him at Jerusalem, "Get up, let us flee, or there will be no escape for us from Absalom. Hurry, or he will soon overtake us and bring disaster down upon us and attack the city with the edge of the sword." The king's officials said to the king, "Your servants are ready to do whatever our lord the king decides." So the king left, followed by all his household, except 10 concubines whom he left behind to look after the house. And the king left, followed by all the people, and they stopped at the last house, and all his officials passed by him, all the Cherethites and all the Pelethites and all of the 600 Gittites who had followed him from Gath. They all passed on before the king. So Absalom winds up going to Hebron, and has people acclaim him as king, is what would happen in the intervening verses. And now David is told that the hearts of the people are with Absalom. So David flees Jerusalem, but this isn't kind of a, running in the middle of the night, scared for his life. This is a royal procession. Several important meetings and conversations happen in the following verses that we're not going to read all of that because I want to get to the rest of the story. But David flees Jerusalem with his royal household and his procession, which continues in verse 31. Just skip down past all of the other stuff. David was told, no, this should be 32 or 33, I think.
Yep, 32.
When David came to the summit where God was worshipped, Hushai the Archite came to meet him with his coat torn and earth on his head. David said to him, if you go on with me, you'll be a burden with me. No, I don't listen to what I want to do. I have that 31, 32. I don't know. Anyways, I don't know why I had that extra verse in there, because it's just it's all of these conversations that happen which aren't really meaningful to the story. The story continues, the rebellion continues, and goes on, and we're going to skip ahead to chapter 18 when it kind of all comes to a head. No pun intended, as you will discover. Beginning in verse 1. And David mustered the men who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. And David divided the army into 3 groups, 1/3 under the command of Joab. Joab's still here working it, right? 1/3 under the command of Abishai of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite. The king said to the men, I myself will also go out with you. But the men said, you shall not go out, for if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they won't care about us, but you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore, it is better that you send us help from the city. The king said to them, whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood at the side of the gate where all the army marched out by hundreds and by thousands. And the king gave orders to Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders concerning Absalom. So the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. And the men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David, and the slaughter there was great on that day, 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest claimed more victims that day than the sword.
Wow.
David stays out of the battle once more. Remember chapter 11, right, where he did that in the story of Bathsheba? But this time his decision not to go into battle seems to be a decision based upon wisdom, not upon him shirking his responsibility, because this is a decision his military advisors commend to him. The king wants the coup defeated, make no mistake, but he doesn't want Absalom to die. Once again, forgiveness and consequences, right? He doesn't want Absalom to have to face any consequences for what's happened. So he urges his commanders, deal gently with Absalom for my sake. David remains a brilliant military commander, though, and he does successfully defeat the armies of Absalom and all of Israel in the field of battle, with just those who remain loyal to David. So he's successful in his battle. And the line, the forest claimed more victims that day than the sword, could be a foreshadowing to the death of Absalom, which is to come in the next section. We're going to jump to that now in verse 9. So Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on the mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak. His head caught fast in the oak, and he was left hanging between heaven and earth while the mule that was under him went on. A man saw it and told Joab, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. Joab said to the man who told him, what? You saw him? Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. The man said to Joab, even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not raise my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, for my sake, protect the young man Absalom. And on the other hand, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there's nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof. Joab said, I won't waste time like this with you. He took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them in the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. And the 10 young men, Joab's armor bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. The entrapment of Absalom seems to be by chance. No one planned it. It's as though kind of a great darkness has surrounded him. It's not that Joab's army successfully outwitted him. It's this kind of massively odd thing where Absalom, who is very handsome and long, beautiful hair, his hair gets caught in the branches and he gets stuck there. The Hebrew is not clear whether it's head or his hair which gets caught in the tree. Just to be clear about that, the Hebrew is a little unclear on that, though it seems to be his well-storied hair that people always talked about. And he's left here suspended between heaven and earth, life and death. And an unnamed man sees this but doesn't act. And if you think about it, this unnamed man is smart, because you remember what happened when someone found Saul at weakness and said, I'm going to kill Saul. David killed him. So he's apparently been with David long enough to know, you don't take advantage of moments like this and lay your hands against someone because you think it's going to curry favor with David. So it's almost harkening back to the more righteous and just days of David in some ways. Joab, however, is the man who never flinches from doing what the king needs. He is a real, he's happy with the muscle for the king. And he's also the man of action with his armor bearers. And one wonders if this action is kind of related to the ruthlessness which Joab was complicit in the murder of Uriah earlier in the narrative. But Joab does it, put spears in his heart, and then has his armor bearers surround him and finish him off. Continuing then in verse, how did I want to go? Yeah. Verse continuing, when to skip ahead to verse 31. Then the Cushite came, and the Cushite, and so several people come to David, and they're all afraid to say what happened, so they all leave. But the Cushite comes, and the Cushite says, "Good tidings for you, my lord the king, for the Lord has vindicated you this day, delivering you from the power of all who rose up against you." King said to the Cushite, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" The Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to do you harm be like that young man." The king was deeply moved, went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would that I had died instead of you, oh Absalom, my son, my son." So several messengers come. The first messenger is Ahimaaz, who's too afraid to report the death of Absalom to David. The second runner, an outsider unconnected, arrives with the same message of good news, giving praise to God, doesn't seem to know of the king's desire for his son's safety, and so imagines David will be glad to hear of the death of the leader of the coup, the death of Absalom. And interestingly enough, contrary to the rage with which he responded to the death of Saul, or the indifference with which he responded to the death of Uriah, David responds in grief and in mourning, and it really is kind of a poignant verse. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son." And the Hebrew itself carries that sense of just repetitive wailing grief. David's sins have been visited upon his own family, and the grief of that reality is immense. It's almost more than David can even bear. And that's actually where we're stopping tonight. So.
Oh, wow.
We're ending a little earlier than I anticipated, but let's go ahead and turn that screen share off. And what questions, comments? This is kind of a dark and painful story. So I wanted to be sure I had a little extra time for comments or conversation afterwards.
Yeah, and Carolyn might know this offhand. I think it was Faulkner that wrote a piece called "Absalom, oh Absalom."
Yeah, I haven't read it. There's that.
I've read it. Yeah,
Faulkner,
I've read about it, but I've never read it. I just
Yeah, I'm
wondered.
a librarian. I put it on the shelf, but I haven't actually read it.
Yeah, I just wondered what kind of moral or metaphor he extracts from the story. I'll have to check it out. Maybe that'll be a good book club selection.
Yeah, maybe. But Faulkner is known for the family secrets and consequences. So it's not surprising that he would pick that as a quote.
Yeah. Curious.
Interesting.
Other thoughts, comments, questions?
I'm just reminded of last week when you mentioned that, for women who want to go back to the way that things were, have a look, you really want to go back there. And that's what went through my mind when all these women, had such tremendous hardship. They were merely chattel to the men. I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah, and it's this is a horrible section of why there's two crimes that are so horrible that it gives life in prison: rape and murder.
Mm-hmm.
There's a good way, there's a good reason for that, and this has a lot to say about it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously I have not been raped. My ex-wife was. The damage it does, most people would rather be killed.
Mm-hmm.
So this is this is a horrible but intuitive part of the Bible. And yet God still lets David be the father, if you count the things like you do in Numbers, he becomes the son of God. So it's just really hard.
Mhm.
It's really hard to read.
There's a line in the Hebrew scripture where it talks about how God is a God who visits the sins of the fathers upon their children.
Right.
And I think that this is a story that illustrates really keenly what's intended by that. And it's not as though God kind of maliciously makes people suffer for the sins of their ancestors, but it's rather acknowledging that sin operates generationally and that patterns of behavior are learned and repeated over and over again. And that to me is a part of the real tragedy here. Is that, and I think that's why David's grief is so immense, because David knows what kind of an example he has and has not set for his kids. And he, so it's like any parent watching your child make the absolute worst decision in the world and feeling in the pit of your stomach that they maybe learned that from you. So I mean, it's one thing for you to have to suffer the consequences, but when you see your kids move that, and I know I've had experiences, I've talked with people, for example, who have families with alcoholic histories. And sometimes what moves a parent to sobriety is seeing their kid move to addiction.
Yeah.
And their own sobriety didn't matter to them, but their kids does. And once they see their kids repeating those behaviors, that's when they'll make a change. And so some of that kind of generational layer of sin, I think, is a real part of this narrative that I think gets at some of the pathos, and I think connects as well, I think, to a lot of our lives, because all of our families have their own stories of brokenness and pain. And so I feel like even though we may not resonate so profoundly and precisely with David and his family's story, we see echoes, right, of the way that generational brokenness operates in our own families.
Yes.
Yeah.
Amen.
Mhm.
My father's father kicked him, and my father kicked me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It may have ended with me because, as far as I know, I never had any children.
Don't say that. You probably got like 18,000 all over the universe, man.
Well, and it's like, you know, in my family, the generational sin was racism. My great grandfather was in the Ku Klux Klan. My great grandfather was an absolute racist, and that those racist tendencies were passed down, and that was broken eventually in my family. But it required some real fighting in the family to say we're not going to be that kind of people. And then no one wants to talk about that part of the family story, right? When my great grandpa died and we were getting ready for his funeral, my grandfather died, we're getting ready for his funeral, I told the story that I'd been told about my grandpa kind of pushing against the racism of my great grandfather. It was fascinating. My aunts and uncles all denied that story happened because the great grandpa wasn't really that bad. He was just a product of his own time. And so this idea that after someone dies, you kind of want to start forgetting all of those parts of the story that are real, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know my own grandfather was, I would call a typical racist. I mean, he didn't hate blacks, but he felt that they should lead separate lives. And, you know, he was born probably, I think, around 1905, 1907. And do I forgive him for being born in that era and not having access to any real education or differing points of view, a very insular, isolated kind of life? So how would you approach that? Would you forgive them and say, okay, you know, I can forgive, but do you excuse, you know, like you were talking about earlier, you know, forgiveness doesn't mean you excuse it.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's something I'm still working through.
Well, I think that's something we're working with as a country is, I mean, we can't expect people 100 years ago to have the same views on race that we have now. But we should still be able to talk honestly about the views of 100 years ago being wrong. and that they've had a cost to them. And I think that that's one of the difficulties when you talk about this nature of generational sin, is that you don't want to be anachronistic or assuming things that, you couldn't really assume. Lord knows who knows what I would have thought if I'd been alive in 1860 and been born in the South into a slaveholding family. I mean, I'm well aware that I have the views I have because of my own upbringing, right? And so you've got to have a little bit of humility with that. But I think that the stories that we're seeing is the cost of sin is real, and is deep, and the way that David's one evening, a momentary decision with Bathsheba creates this domino effect that results the death of Uriah, the death of the child, the taking of Bathsheba into the royal family, massive familial dysfunction, the death of Amnon, the death of Absalom, the rape of Tamar, and all of these things, they seem to just cascade one after another upon the family, and no one seems to be able to stand up and put a stop to it. And as we see when we do Solomon in a couple of weeks here, Solomon in some ways does, there's parts of Solomon that are righteous, but there are other parts of Solomon that he seems to have a lot of his dad's own proclivities. And it kind of plays out throughout the story of the whole dynasty of the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel, as we see as that goes down. So it's almost like watching a train wreck, right? You can't stop it, but you can't take your eyes off of it. Well, thank you for being here tonight. Just as a note, so for next week is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, and so at St. John's, that's of course a federal holiday, so we take the day off at the church. But what we do instead of taking the day fully off is we do a day of readings. And so if any of you are free at any point during the day next week, anytime between 9 and 7, you can go ahead and sign up at the parish information table, or by going to sjegh.com/MLK readings to take an open slot there. What's happening right now is I've got Vestry and Finance Commission members coming on because we've got a Vestry meeting at 7. So that's what that is. I'm going to turn off the recording now as well.
Real quickly, is there Zoom for the readings?
No, it's not, but it'll be broadcast on Facebook Live.
Oh, okay.
And Father, whatever parts aren't open, that aren't taken,